Hello and welcome to part 6 of the Industrial Revolution. Now we're going to talk about classical liberalism. Now the roots of liberalism goes back to the Renaissance or the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment. If we had to pin down who the first true liberal was, we probably would argue that it was John Locke, the political philosopher. But liberalism itself is a loaded term, especially when we put it in the modern context. Liberalism today does not bear the same resemblance as that of classical liberalism that we're about to talk about, right? Liberalism today has to do with issues like, a larger central government, bigger government, abdication of personal responsibility, the tyranny of speech through ideas like political correctness and stuff like that. And that would kind of run counter to the ideas of classical liberals. Classical liberals would probably be more in line with what we would see in modern day conservatism. These classical liberals of the industrial era, they are rebelling against Catholic theology. They're operating on the general belief that people are generally good and rational and reasonable, and therefore they do not need to have big government. They don't need to have government or censorship or even the church to monitor them and tell them how to believe or how to behave, right? They believe that the free interchange of ideas and goods and services, this enlightenment ideology will create an enlightened utopia for all, right? Modern liberalism, though, can trace its origins from some of the privations that were generated out of the Industrial Revolution, right? Now, like I said, John Locke is probably the first true liberal, though he predates the Industrial Revolution because of his belief that the human beings are born neither bad or good, right? But they are born naturally rational, right? And so that they or should be free to contract with each other and form societies, the social contract theory, and that different ideas of religion and things like that should be tolerated. Now, during the Industrial Revolution, Adam Smith is going to be the first of these classical liberals to confront industrialization, right? He's going to take a look at economies, right? Now, he's going to claim to be a scientist, much in the same nature of Hobbes and Locke or Isaac Newton, right? And in 1776, he's going to publish a book called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Today, we just call it Wealth of Nations, okay? And in this, he takes a look at economies, and he says that economies are governed by the same laws like what you see in nature, right? And so therefore, if economies are governed by laws, and these in this case are laws of supply and demand, then humans, being rational and reasonable, can discover these laws. And that these laws are unerring. You can discover them and then you can follow them. And so that means that any kind of tampering by the government via regulations or tariff barriers or taxes or whatever, artificially, any kind of artificially encouraging or hurting the formation of monopolies, retard that economic process, that natural law of supply and demand. So he says the world and national economies are healthiest when they're left alone, when you have free trade, when individuals are allowed to pursue their own self-interest. When you do this, when you've established these conditions, the economies will work and the market will work guided by what he referred to as the invisible hand, right? An invisible hand which will govern and take care of all. And that the pursuit of self-interest multiplied across society will generate the demand and the production and the distribution and the wealth, which then will flow down to all people, right? By the same token then, according to the Wealth of Nations, benevolence, charity, altruism, though virtuous, doesn't really improve the conditions of the poor because it's not part of that natural law of the economy. Classical liberal Thomas Malthus will actually take Adam Smith's ideas and apply it to the population with kind of a terrifying effect. He wrote a book in 1798 called Essay on Populations, and in this he said that the biggest problem on the planet right now is that that food supplies, the world food supply, increases arithmetically, right? It's a gradual, steady slope. while populations are increasing geometrically. They're doubling, then square, and so on, right? So they're a curve, a never increasing curve. And if that's being the case, then sooner or later, the population is going to run out of food. The food supply is going to be outstripped by the population. And that the only thing that can slow this down is going to have to be some kind of demographic disaster. Famine, war, epidemics, pandemics, natural disasters, right? Now, unfortunately, human life is being preserved and the planet further depleted, according to Malthus, by modern medicine, extended periods of peace, and charity, right, which all encourage the poor to have more children. All right. Now, since 1798, Malthus's conclusions have remained controversial. I mean, even all the way to the modern day. For example, he failed to foresee the use of science and technology and industry to increase the food supply, right? But the general point that he's making was this, that the resources on the planet are finite. Well, while the potential increase of population is limitless. And with that, that carries some great weight, and with that also some great fear. Classical liberal David Ricardo took this in a more depressing direction when taking a look at the potentiality of prosperity, right? He wrote a book called Principles of Political Economy and Taxation that was published in 1817 that took a look at wages. And from this, he came with a theory called the iron law of wages. And he basically describes it as this. If the population of workers is low, employers must compete to attract and keep these workers and offer them higher wages, so wages will go up. However, higher wages lead to healthier workers. Healthier workers lead to more reproductive workers, making more children. More children translates into more workers, and more workers then begin to saturate the market, and they can begin being paid less, and because they can always be replaced, right? So now wages will begin to plummet. Wages will maintain a level that the most desperate person is willing to accept in order to do the work, right? The low wages then lead to unhealthy workers. Unhealthy workers begin to die, the workforce contracts, and the cycle begins all over again, right? Now, in the case during the Industrial Revolution, because of the population explosion and immigration, you have no shortage of workers, right? And therefore, the iron law of wages dictate that wages are going to naturally plummet. Now, ultimately, what this means is that the workers are going to have no recourse but to take some action, right? For example, in 1811, beginning in 1811, continuing about 1817, the Luddites began going around England and breaking up machines. They were formed in early 1811 by General Ned Ludd. He called his group the Army of Redressers, and they would send out anonymous, threatening letters to factory workers, and they began breaking factories at night and wrecking the machinery, breaking the equipment. In February of 1812, the British government reacted to this. They passed the Frame Breaking Act, which actually made the act of breaking up machinery a capital offense, right? Towards the end of the 18th century, the classic liberal theorists began to be challenged by a new type of liberal called the utilitarians, right? Like this guy, Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham outlined the basics of utilitarianism in his great work, The Principles on the Morals and Legislation. Okay, this was published in 1789. Right? Bentham believes in reason like other Enlightenment thinkers, but he's not interested in using it discovering unwavering, unvarying laws of nature or economics or society, but he believes that reason can be used to discover laws that are practical, useful, and beneficial to humans. Right? Bentham believes that the best society and the best government and the best institutions were those that brought the greatest amount of happiness to the greatest number of people. Right? Any laws then, under utilitarian thought, any laws, belief, or institution that did not further this goal should be abolished, like the aristocracy, state religion, even slavery, right? Less radically, other institutions that have potential to be usefulness just need to be reformed, like English common law, the English school systems, the poor law, and the prisons, right? Utilitarians also demanded the end of press censorship and the introduction of complete male suffrage, right? So while wanting barriers and unfair privilege abolished and reforms of those institutions that stand in the way, Bentham also advocates a degree of government intervention, government regulation. This is something that had not been seen before this. John Stuart Mill is an example of a classic utilitarian, all right, which is actually kind of pretty closely in line with what you would see as the modern liberal of today, right? Now, he begins off with a lot of classical liberal thought, but when he writes On Liberty in 1859, you start to see some of this utilitarianism creep in. On Liberty promotes the idea of example, like universal suffrage, and that actually included women. Right? He advocated laissez-faire economies, but also the elimination of constrictions on any personal freedoms. When he wrote his follow-up books, you see this began to evolve on principles on representative government, for example, and his principles of political economy. He wrote these as a member of parliament, and you start to see him begin to confront the Industrial Revolution with a more interventionist policy. He argues that it's not enough to give people the vote if they can't read or if their working and living conditions are so bad that their lives are shortened. Mills argued that free public education, housing, and health care needed to be provided, and that the only institution large enough to provide such things was the federal government, right? Mills became that new type of liberal then. He still believed in the untrammeled personal freedom as long as others were not hurt, and small government only if it was possible. If freedom no longer included the right to exploit the poor or deny them an education or housing or the vote. Rather, to ensure the maximum amount of freedom for all, the public had an obligation to educate, house, and protect all, and if that meant restricting some economic freedoms, then so be it. And if it meant higher taxes on the aristocracy or the rising middle class, well, again, so be it.